This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the Rogue. If you want to hear weekly discussions of TTRPG design and philosophy, check out the Untitled TTRPG podcast I do with Rel over on his YouTube channel and on Spotify. And if you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. Before diving into the 2024 Rogue design, I want to start by following up on something I said last episode with Fighter. When it came to the Fighter's role, I said that they would primarily be damage dealers with secondary control traits. Turn by turn, fighters will most likely find themselves using their action to attack with weapons as opposed to casting spells. However, while other classes seem to lean into damage-dealing features, like the Rogue's Sneak Attack or Paladin's Divine Smite, fighters really leaned into a versatility of fighting styles and weapon masteries, which might emphasize damage, like Graze or Nick, but could also really lean into control effects like push, slow, or topple. After a cursory glance at these options in relation to the other weapon-using classes, I said not to be surprised if the fighter isn't the best damage dealer in the party, which is what I'd like to follow up on. Recently, Treant Monk, a well-known content creator in the 5e optimization community, released a 53-minute video comparing the 2024 fighter to the 2024 monk, rogue, and his previous assumption of baseline damage, which is a warlock casting Eldritch Blast while concentrating on the Hex spell. He demonstrated the expected damage output of a few fighter builds, and what I found interesting was just the range of results. First, he demonstrated the damage output of a quote-unquote sword and board fighter, one that uses a longsword and shield. This build's damage was much less than the monk and rogue base classes. The second build demonstrated was for a greatsword fighter, which used the Graze property as a damage boost. This one had extremely similar damage output to monk and rogue between levels 1 and 10, but then jumped ahead of those other two at level 11 when it got a third extra attack, and stayed ahead all the way through level 20. The third build he showed was incredibly complex mathematically, and it was one that quote-unquote broke him, which showed the impact of having the champion subclass, a shield, and a quarterstaff with the Shillelagh cantrip from Magic Initiate. On his DPR graph, this third build looked similar to the base Greatsword fighter, but again, once it hit level 11, its damage skyrocketed even above the base fighter through level 20. And that's to remember that this last build used a one-handed weapon and a shield, and it outdamaged an optimized base fighter using a two-handed weapon. Now, due to the complex math behind this third build, Treant Monk did say to take his calculations with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, even if it is a ballpark estimate, my biggest takeaway is that a fighter's effectiveness is going to be determined by how it's built, which requires at least a moderate amount of mechanical knowledge to accomplish what you want with the character. Treant Monk's video is linked in the description below if you want to see the analysis for yourself. And let me know some of your takeaways in the comments below. My segue here from Fighter to Rogue is that in 2014, I mentioned that Fighter lacked a distinct class identity. While it had some unique features, they weren't necessarily obvious. Second Wind and Action Surge are useful, but not as frequently usable as Rage, Divine Smite, or Sneak Attack. The fighter's extra ASIs are probably the standout, but they require a decent knowledge of feats to make the most of them. Of course, the most powerful fighter feature is arguably its third and fourth extra attack, which it only gains at higher levels and may never even see since on average campaigns end around level 10. Rogues, on the other hand, had a pretty solid class identity in 2014. They were dex-based damage dealers with, again, their iconic combat feature, Sneak Attack, with movement support from Cunning Action to allow them to stay mobile and hide from enemies. Of the core classes, Rogue also had the most starting skills and 2 expertises right at first level, meaning that in the skills department, it was the strongest choice. A lot of my most fondly remembered characters had Rogue levels, and these proficiencies really helped me as a role player shape their personalities. That all being said, the 2014 Rogue design had some notable flaws, starting with its core feature, Sneak Attack. So once per turn, a character with Sneak Attack can deal extra damage with an attack using a ranged or finesse weapon, as long as they have advantage on the attack roll, or their target has an enemy within 5 feet of them. Unfortunately, throughout most of 5e's run, this meant that rogues were dependent on their teams to set up Sneak Attack to trigger. Rogues had almost no means in their core feature progression to give themselves advantage, meaning they needed an ally to grant it to them, usually with a spell like Fairy Fire or Guiding Bolt, or they needed an ally to stand next to their target. I spent quite a few combat sessions trying to explain this to some fellow players, but oftentimes I'd be hung out to dry and ended up dealing piddly damage as a result. Not to mention the fact that rogues are the only martial class to not get extra attack at 5th level. If my rogue was caught in a one-on-one fight, I knew I was pretty much done for. It's the only class that I've played where I felt as if being one-on-one meant I virtually had no combat options, except to flee and hope I could outrun my pursuer. Now, at 2nd level, rogues do have the ability to hide as a bonus action, which in theory could grant it advantage by being an unseen attacker. However, in 2014, the rules for hiding were a lot less defined, and more often than not, I'd find that a lot of DMs would just rule that the circumstances of the situation aren't appropriate for hiding. That and attacking reveals the rogue's position, meaning that at best, it might work once per fight. If you were a rogue player with different experiences with hiding prior to the release of Tasha's, let me know. And of course, with the release of Tasha's in 2020, Steady Aim was added as an optional rogue class feature, allowing rogues to grant themselves advantage by spending their bonus action and ability to move. It was nice to have internal synergy in the class for once, but the cost of added advantage was in many cases extremely limiting, leaving most rogue builds as being these ranged damage dealers. I'd almost never see melee rogues at tables after this came out, which is a shame since dual wielding is an iconic desired play style for a lot of people who want to play rogues. So, with all that whining out in the open, how does the 2024 Rogue compare to the 2014 version? Like Fighter, I think the new Rogue design really benefits from some String of Pearls game design, in that many revisions of the game's peripheral systems have helped strengthen the Rogue's core mechanics. For example, Sneak Attack hasn't changed at all from the 2014 version, but advantage is much easier to achieve in 2024, with Colby from D4 Deep Dive joking that with his DPR calculations, he just assumes every attack roll is being made with advantage. A great example of this for the Rogue is that rogues get 2 weapon masteries, which isn't as much as the fighters, but even these add a lot to the class. 2 common weapon masteries among finesse weapons are Nick and Vex, the latter of which grants advantage to an attacker's next attack until their next turn once they hit a target. Going back to a dual-wielding rogue, 2-weapon fighting used to be undesirable for many classes because of its bonus action cost, meaning that bonus action heavy classes like Rogue and Ranger often wouldn't take it, which was a shame because those were the classes that iconically used 2 weapons in past editions. Now with Nick, there is no bonus action cost. Potentially, if I'm reading the rules correctly, a rogue on its turn can use a short sword to vex a target, granting advantage on its dagger's Nick attack, and potentially dealing sneak attack damage with the bonus strike. Right from level 1, Rogue has a way to supply itself with advantage. And even if it doesn't, many other classes have access to weapon masteries like Topple, meaning there's a decent chance the target will be knocked prone and you'll be granted advantage on your melee attacks anyways. The rules for hiding are also much clearer. Rather than being determined by a searching creature's passive perception, hiding allows you to gain the invisible condition through a flat DC 15 stealth check, with the onus on the searching creatures to use the search action to find the hider. Due to rogues having a level 1 expertise, most rogues will probably start with a +7 bonus to stealth checks, meaning that, again, there's a decent chance that they'll be able to hide and engage sneak attack that way. In addition, the reworked Skulker feat now works even better, since the hide rules are better defined. Finally, steady aim is now core to the player's handbook. A while ago, I made a video called The Martial Caster Divide, addressing a question a commenter left me about a rogue player at their table feeling like the rogue was underperforming compared to the party's cleric. Now, if I remade that video, I'd probably do some things differently, but one of the frequent comments I got was that steady aim allowed rogues to give themselves advantage, so there was no reason to assume that a rogue couldn't factor in sneak attack. Of course, I think this comment missed the point of the video, which was really examining why you might run into a case where a rogue is consistently underperforming in comparison to a cleric. And one of those reasons is likely that the rogue isn't getting sneak attack. And yes, you could just say, well, rogue, don't be dumb and use steady aim. But back then, it was still technically an optional feature and required a DM's permission to use. And so I didn't want to create a video assuming that every table was using it. Now that it's part of the core game, along with weapon mastery and the new hiding rules, I think rogue players should find it easier than ever to trigger sneak attack without allies, and even easier if they have mindful allies that understand how sneak attack works. So besides some adjustments to those peripheral systems, what's actually new to the rogue base class? Well, the biggest addition is undoubtedly Cunning Strike at level 5. Rogues still don't get extra attack, which is somewhat remedied anyway by the Nick weapon mastery. But starting at 5th level, they can withhold rolling one of their sneak attack dice to activate one of 3 effects: poison, trip, or withdraw. Poison allows them to force a creature to make a con save or be poisoned for a minute, with the affected creature being able to re-roll the con save to end the poison early. Trip knocks a target prone, and withdraw allows the character to move up to half its speed without provoking opportunity attacks. The kicker is that any of these effects can be used as long as the rogue is dealing sneak attack damage, meaning if your rogue is somehow able to deal sneak attack damage off of their own turn, they can use these effects too. At later levels, rogues get even more of these extra effect options in the form of Daze, Knockout, and Obscure, which gives some interesting control options for players that want a little more versatility out of their character. So how does the rogue measure up complexity-wise? With the fighter, I said that the book called it a low complexity class, but I really think it's medium. And I do think that the player's handbook in this case gets it correct that rogue is ultimately low complexity, compared at least to the other core classes. There are some interdependent mechanics that may require some homework to understand, like the example I gave earlier with the short sword, dagger, weapon masteries in order to trigger sneak attack. But with a little bit of party support and setup, I think rogue players will find that they're able to use sneak attack more often than not. Their reliable bonus action in the form of cunning action makes their action economy both loopable and satisfying. I found that most players feel better about getting to use their movement action and bonus action in a turn, rather than not using bonus action or movement, but having their action do an even bigger effect. The real complexity, I think, is going to come down to feat selection and how to use the Cunning Strike options. But even so, I think that the explanations are straightforward enough that with a little bit of practice, most players should pick up on the rogue's gameplay loop. Overall, I think the class delivers what most players that pick it expect: a dexterity-based damage-dealing class with a handful of tricks that will probably work most of the time. Of course, with such a narrow build focus also comes some predictable weaknesses. The first is survivability. Rogues are only trained in light armor, and so they'll likely start with a 14 AC, which is not great, especially if they're gonna go a melee route. They also only have a D8 hit die, meaning that their hit point pool is also likely going to be lower than most other martials like fighters, barbarians, and even rangers. Like fighters, they don't have great area of effect options, which combined with low survivability means that they're vulnerable to being swarmed by lots of lower powered enemies. Where I see rogues shining is against one or two big bad brute monsters that can easily be distracted by tankier melee characters, allowing a rogue to dart in and dart out with cunning action or hide, so they can avoid being targeted. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to weaknesses is that skills tend to mean less in 2024 than they did in 2014. For example, in 2014, grappling and shoving were resolved through competing athletics or acrobatics checks. While escaping a grapple still uses those skills, in general, you see them come up less in the rules. When I first saw that reliable talent was being gained earlier at level 7 rather than 11, I was a little flabbergasted, but again, seeing the whole string of pearls made the decision make a lot more sense. Yes, rogues with the reliable talent are going to have incredibly strong hiding skills, but I would argue they should have had those all along. Unfortunately, it does mean that the rogue's focus on skill and expertise development is less mechanically meaningful than it used to be, save for some niche cases. On to subclasses. Like with Fighter, I want to present the subclasses in order of simplest to most complex. In my opinion, the Assassin is the simplest option. Assassinate allows a character to have a higher chance of going first, which also increases the likelihood for them to be able to use surprising strikes and deal extra damage. In the episode on backgrounds and origin feats, I mentioned that Alert had the potential to be incredibly powerful with the right party composition, and this is a great example of how. Even if the Assassin with advantage on initiative isn't starting in the optimal spot, Alert is just one extra way for the Assassin to switch initiative places with an ally to better guarantee triggering surprising strikes, or to use the initiative advantage to swap with an ally that has a better opening move. In addition, the tool proficiencies of the Disguise and Poisoner's kit have been moved to 3rd level, as well as automatically gaining them, which synergizes well with the base class's Poison Cunning Strike option. At 9th level, the key combat feature is that assassins can move after using steady aim, taking away one of the feature's key costs. Overall, Assassin provides enhancements to the rogue's core playstyle, and although there's a little bit more to remember, I think it's the simplest of the options presented. Next up is the Soul Knife. Now, when examining the Fighter, I ordered Eldritch Knight as simpler than Psy Warrior because I found spell slots to be an easier resource to learn than the energy dice, since other players at the table are potentially demonstrating how spell slots work with their characters. Now, I stand by on that ordering for Fighter, since there was a lot of resource management within the Psy Warrior at 3rd level, but Soul Knife is a little different. Yes, it has energy dice like Psy Warrior, but at 3rd level, they're mostly used for utility rather than combat, so there isn't as much pressure to use them optimally. In fact, the subclass's core combat feature, Psychic Blades, doesn't have a cost. You can use it over and over again. Now, at 9th level, you can use the energy dice to enhance your Psychic Blades, but by 9th level, I think even a new player will reasonably have gotten used to managing at least a moderate level of complication on their character sheet. Arcane Trickster, on the other hand, has more resource management than Soul Knife by comparison. I don't think it's necessarily more than Eldritch Knight, at least until the level 17 feature, but by comparison, Soul Knife is so much more simple than even the streamlined spellcasting of Arcane Trickster that Arcane Trickster looks complex by comparison. And the last one is going to be Thief. Now, Thief isn't an inherently complex subclass, but the reason I rank it as the most complex of the 4 is that it's optimally utilized with knowledge of adventuring gear. The core trait I honed in on was Fast Hands, where a thief can take the utilize action as a bonus action. Adventuring gear, like acid, alchemy fire, ball bearings, and oil, can lead to some incredibly memorable and creative moments, especially if a player makes the most of the crafting rules using a tool proficiency. However, it takes weaving together multiple peripheral systems to the class's core features to make the most of it, which is why I think it's ultimately the most complex of the 4 rogue subclasses. As for multiclassing, I think rogue could really benefit from dipping 1 level of fighter to get a fighting style like archery or 2-weapon fighting, or dip a level into monk to get access to martial arts. That way, even if a rogue finds themselves stuck in a one-on-one fight, they may have a reliable way to follow up their usual attack action with a martial arts bonus action. In fact, because rogues don't have extra attack, taking 5 levels of an extra attack class is a great way to boost its performance. Going 5 levels into Battle Master Fighter is going to give you an even greater toolbox of control effects, along with an action surge right when you need it most. 5 levels of Monk are going to add some great defensive features like unarmored defense and deflect attacks, and you can even pick up Stunning Strike that way, which could just be a neat effect to set up your own sneak attack. And finally, Ranger is a classic rogue multi-class option. Now, extra attack and Hunter's Mark on their own are great, but one particular synergy that I like using sometimes is Rogue with Beastmaster Ranger, where you can send your primal companion to sit 5 feet next to a target. So for whatever reason, if you don't have advantage, you can at least engage your own sneak attack without having to rely on an ally's participation. That being said, if you have another class you're using as your base, Rogue isn't a bad class to dip into. Although it's not as mechanically significant, expertise can be a nice way to shape your character's personality. And cunning action is a great, free, reliable bonus action that can make your action economy feel more fulfilling. Personally, I don't think I'd mind taking 5 levels of Rogue just to get Cunning Strike. I don't think it's a super powerful feature, but it just seems like so much fun I want to play around with it. To round out this examination, I want to loop back to Treant Monk's damage analysis series. Prior to the damage analysis, where he sat down to do the math, Treant Monk's prediction was that Rogue was going to be the new weakest class of 2024. In 2014, that dishonor was held by the Monk, which failed to be viable in every category, from damage to survivability to control options. While I've had a few debates surrounding whether or not the 2014 Monk is even worth playing, my chief complaint was that more often than not, I found that 2014 Monk players found themselves unable to participate, much less meaningfully contribute. Because the Monk was so underpowered, they'd often get knocked out early in combat, meaning that their player had no choices to make. Even if Rogue is the weakest class, the margin of, say, weakest to second weakest to third weakest is so much smaller in 2024 than it was in 2014. And I think with all the changes I laid out, the Rogue would still be really fun to play. That all being said, after some analysis, the new Rogue base class has comparable damage output to fighters and monks, even with just the base class. And with a little bit of optimization, it's a fairly competitive damage dealer. Yes, it still has some survivability concerns, but in terms of delivering the promise of the core Rogue experience, I think 2024 does a much better job. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.